Hello there, everyone. Thanks for coming along on this Sunday afternoon. While we're just waiting for people to join the session, can you introduce yourself in the chat? Just say who you are and where you come from. And if you have any questions during the session, if you just put them into the Q&A there, and then at the end, I'll have a look and I'll answer as many of them as I can. Well, good afternoon, everybody. We'll make a start, as I think most people who are going to join the session have already done so. Remember, if you want to ask me any questions during the session, if you just pop them into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen there, and at the end, I'll try and answer as many as I can. So thanks very much again for coming to my session, Ways with Words, the Pillar of Vocabulary. So my name's Claire Seckham. I'm a primary languages teacher and an independent consultant. I currently teach Spanish in 2 primary schools, and I've been involved with projects recently like BBC Bite Size, and I'm the subject leader for Oak National Academy as well. If you want to see any of the resources that I'm going to show you during this session, then my website is called Lightbulb Languages. And also I describe some of the activities in a bit more depth on my blog, and you can see the URL of my blog there. It's called Changing Phase. So this website is changing-phase.blogspot.com. And like I said, you can read about things in a bit more detail there. If you're on Twitter and you would like to follow me on Twitter, then that's my Twitter handle at the bottom there. So let's get on. So in this session, we're going to be looking at why there is currently a focus on vocabulary, and then we'll be discussing how to choose vocabulary for your scheme of work, how to present it to the children and how to practice it, how to support its retention, and then how we can extend children's pot of words so that they can say what they want to say. And of course, all the way along, there will be plenty of ideas, things that you can take away and try in your own classroom. So in the early days of primary languages, we're talking 10 or 15 years ago now, the subject was often criticised for children just learning lots of lists of nouns, but nothing else that they could use to build sentences with. Fortunately, we've moved away from that now, but still, when we think of the word vocabulary, we tend to think of nouns or at the very least single words. In fact, the vocabulary that we include in our schemes of work and that we teach should include single words, but also lexical chunks. So these chunks are groups of words which are commonly found together, which have a clear and a formulaic usage and which convey a particular meaning in the same way that single words do. So examples of lexical chunks from the early stages of learning might include greetings such as buenos dias and questions like comment t'appelles-tu? So for the benefit of this presentation, vocabulary includes single words and lexical chunks. Sometimes I might say words rather than vocabulary, but I'm referring to the same thing. Now, the Teaching School Council's MFL Pedagogy Review in 2016 outlined the three threads of grammar, phonics, and vocabulary. The review looked at languages in key stages 3 and 4, but said that much of what we say is also relevant to pedagogy in the upper end of primary. And indeed, we are now seeing the effects of the report in key stage 2. So the main points to note are, firstly, the vocabulary you choose should be informed by its frequency of occurrence in the language, because children will be able to say more with higher frequency language. Secondly, the verb lexicon, the group of verbs that you teach, is of particular importance. And thirdly, teachers need a strong repertoire of techniques for teaching and having children practice and use the vocabulary. It also mentions looking at the origins of words and words shared between languages, so cognates and false friends, as well as patterns like prefixes. And this, of course, links to the curriculum for Key Stage 2 English. So this intertwining of vocabulary, grammar, and phonics has informed the most recent Ofsted framework, where they're referred to as the three pillars. So that's where the term pillar comes from. Now, pillars implies that they are separate structures, but I prefer to think of them in the same way as Rachel Hawkes, which is as an intertwined plait. It's worth noting that without grammar, very little can be meaningfully conveyed, even with a lot of words. But without vocabulary, nothing can be conveyed. So learning some vocabulary is the first step towards language output. Now, Hobson and Milton said in 2019 that knowledge of the most frequent 2,000 words in particular is an important feature in successful communication in a foreign language. Now, 2,000 words over a limited lesson time in Key Stage 2 is a very tall order, and grammar and structure would certainly suffer at the hands of vocabulary learning. Rachel Hawkes recommends a lexicon of 500 words over the 4 years of Key Stage 2, which tallies with level A1 on the Common European Framework. Now, when broken down per year and per week, this works out at only a small number of words per week, say 3 or 4. Alternatively, it's a pot of 12 words or so that you might use over a number of weeks. So you can see from this list here of the most frequent words in French that not all the words are suitable for Key Stage 2 or would make for very exciting lessons. And also, these words are not of inherent interest to 7 to 11-year-olds. We will necessarily have to choose some words which are lower down on the list of frequency, but in which children are interested. So the box in the bottom left corner there contains the most frequent animal words, interesting, including the word virus. And that's a good example of this. So chat, chien, souris, and so on are lower frequency, but very interesting for young children and very good for explaining points of grammar such as gender and plurals and so on. So we also need to make sure that our list of vocabulary is going to include nouns, but it must also have other parts of speech which will help children to build phrases and sentences, with the verbs being particularly important. A couple of years ago, I heard Rachel Hawkes speaking at the Northern Primary Languages Show about vocabulary, and this gave me the push that I needed to review my scheme of work for Spanish, something I'd been mulling over for a while, because I had the feeling that my scheme of work had more than the 500 words, and I wasn't happy with the sequence of the units in any case. It was a bit haphazard. There wasn't a logical thread of grammar and structure or of verb forms, because it had kind of grown organically over the 11 years that I had been teaching primary Spanish up to that point. So I got out some big pieces of A1 paper and my coloured markers, and I started off by mapping out my units and their vocabulary on those pieces of paper. And this gave me a really clear view of the grammar and the progression, as well as the number of lexical units. And I was interested to see that there actually wasn't as much vocabulary as I thought. I then reorganized the unit so that there is now a better thread of grammar and of verbs. So, for example, I moved family and pets into year 3 from year 5, as this allowed for some expansion from units 1 and 2 of the verbs tener, to have, and llamarse, to be called. And the nouns followed on nicely from the previous unit, which introduces gender. I also moved weather from year 5 into year 4, as the language is relatively simple, but moved description and adjectival agreement from year 4 into year 5, as it's always seemed a bit complex for year 4 and I've never been entirely happy with it. The only new units are Unit 7 and Unit 17. The next step was choosing the vocabulary, the grammar, and the phonics for my new scheme of work units. So I kept a lot of vocabulary the same, as I already had a lot of resources and I didn't want to create too much work for myself. It was interesting to see the frequency of the vocabulary that I was using. So, for example, this is my pro forma for Unit 4 of my scheme of work. And the pencil case words are pretty low frequency, many of them outside the top 5,000. And it's the black numbers in brackets which show you the frequency. But of course, pencil case words are of great importance to primary children. Using these words is going to motivate them, and they're really good first nouns to use to explain gender and to explain indefinite articles as well. The indefinite articles, which will be used with all the nouns, are very high frequency. And I've used the 10 most common nouns in Spanish, which are listed at the bottom of that box, as examples for identifying the gender of nouns. Something else worth considering when you're choosing vocabulary for your scheme of work are cognates. So words that look like English, often sound like English, and which mean the same thing. And these are easier for children to learn and to remember, and provide a useful exercise as well in phonics, because the words might look like English, but they don't necessarily sound the same. Now, this is the list that I have for Year 6's first unit, which is all about places in town and describing your town as well. And we always start with the 8 cognate places and use those to build all our sentences in the first instance. Incidentally, you can see here that I've color coded the principal parts of speech so that I can see the spread better in my scheme. Now, another thing to think about when you're choosing the vocabulary for your scheme of work are your phonic objectives for that series of lessons. So, are there any particular sounds that you'd like your vocabulary to exemplify? So, an example of this are the pets that I use in my family and pets unit. And I deliberately chose 2 that have the sound, that's pájaro and conejo. Then there are 2 that have the rolled R, perro and ratón. And then there's one with the th sound, which is pez. And they all as well provide the 3 different ways of making the plural in Spanish. There's also examples of masculine and feminine nouns, and they've all got their indefinite articles with them too. Now, once you've chosen your vocabulary, it's time to start teaching it. Now, when it comes to presenting and practicing the new vocabulary with the children, it's worth considering what exactly the learners need to know about the new words. So they need to know the meaning. They need to know the part of speech of the word, including the gender, if it's appropriate. They need to know the pronunciation or the sound of each word. They need to know how it's spelt, and then how it's going to fit in with the other words that they've learned within a phrase or a sentence. And these things are necessarily going to influence the methods that you use to present and to practice the words. Now, there's also some discussion about how many words or chunks you can introduce to your learners in one go. Secondary practitioners seem to advocate presenting 10 to 15 items all in one go. But this is too much for our beginner linguists. The number of words that you choose is going to depend on the age and the experience of your learners, as well as the nature of the words themselves. So if you're using largely cognates, you can probably have more, for example. I would probably use 5 or 6 words or chunks as a general rule, with a few more for older or more experienced learners. Now, for the initial presentation stage, I'm a big fan of flashcards because there is so much that you can do with them. As well as using them for introducing vocabulary, you can use them for games, you can use them to build sentences. I'm not so keen on presenting with a PowerPoint slide because my arm gets tired with all the pointing. We do need to be mindful, though, of what the children's first stored image of a new word is going to be. They will store an image of what the new word looks like as soon as they hear it. And especially if they're beginner learners, they're going to use their knowledge of English phonics to do that. So, to use the example you can see here, it's likely that a child hearing una plaza without seeing the word is going to store that word as plaza with a th. Now, we need to engage a multimodal approach as much as possible. And this means letting the children access the words in as many different ways as possible. So the ideal flashcard will have firstly an image to show the meaning. Secondly, the word to show the spelling. It'll also have some kind of color coding to show the gender if it's a noun. And then, of course, the children are going to hear the word as well. And you may remember the pets from a few slides ago. You could see the image, you could see the word, and you could see the color coding for the gender. And we use this for initial practice of the words and then remove the words for later practice. Another aspect of the multimodal approach that you may want to include is doing a gesture or an action for the word as well. So this multimodal approach offers children several different access points for comprehension. It invites participation and also it motivates repeated practice of the vocabulary, and it engages a number of different senses in the learning process as well. Now, presenting the new vocabulary and practicing it on one sole occasion is not going to be enough to embed the words in the children's long-term memories or for them to be able to recall it when necessary. We need to introduce it on multiple occasions over a relatively long period of time, allowing a gap in between each one. And this spacing leads to a better long-term learning of the vocabulary. It's crucial that you allow learners to forget the words and then to revisit them. And this repetition can take the form of speaking practice, but we can also repeat the words in different ways, such as word puzzles and PowerPoint activities, like you can see here. So on the white sheet there, you have lots of different word puzzles, all practicing the months there in French. And you've got a word search, a little puzzle, a word spiral to find the words in, and then matching the words up into the grid. Then examples of things that you could do on a PowerPoint slide. On the pink one there, those words appear one by one on the screen. Some of them are verbs, some of them are not. And I'm training year 6 to spot an infinitive which ends in Spanish in AR, ER, or IR. So when an individual word appears, if it looks like a verb, they have to shout verb. If not, they have to stay quiet. Then on the green screen there, those fruit words, they appear letter by letter onto the screen very slowly, and the children have to call the word out as soon as they recognize it. Then on the yellow screen, again, you can see the fruits, but they've got quite a few letters missing. They again appear one by one, and the children have to say which one it is as soon as they recognize it. So here are some ideas for practicing vocabulary with a view to consolidating the meaning of the words. So firstly, trash or treasure. This is a categorization activity where children are given a collection of words or chunks which can be sorted into various different groups. I do this activity with dates. And so in the pot of words I give them, there are some days of the week, there are some numbers, and there are also some months. So the children work in pairs, and the idea is that they have to put into the treasure chest the words that you're asking for. Everything else goes into the trash. So the first sort that we do is for the days of the week. So they put all the days of the week cards into the treasure. Then we debrief, we check that they found the right ones, and then put all the word cards back into the same pile. And the next sort is to find all of the numbers. So they have to put all the words that are numbers into the treasure. Everything else goes into the trash. Now, every time they sort the words, they get quicker because they've seen the words before. And as they're doing one sort, they've been able to think about the meanings of all of the other words as well. Something else that you might want to try is what I call the pointing game. It might have another name, I don't know. It's a very simple activity where you, the teacher, or it could be another child as well, says one of the words or one of the chunks, weather phrases in this case, and then the children all point to the right picture on their copy. I have a copy on the interactive board as well, so that when they've all chosen, I can point to the correct one and the children can self-assess and self-correct. It's actually a very nice, very quiet activity, this one. Also useful for thinking about meaning and for reading the new words are things like shape puzzles or tarsier puzzles and dominoes. And going back to flashcards as well, there are lots of games that you can play with flashcards that will work on meaning and which will oblige children to recall the words that you've been working on. My class's favourite game with flashcards is I call it Which Card. So I get my flashcards, I jumble them all up, then I hold them quite close to me so that nobody can see in the side. And the children have to think and also listen to everybody else to see if they can work out which card is on the top of my pile. And then here are some ways of practicing vocabulary with a view to clarifying and embedding spelling. So we need to be aware of and we need to anticipate the sorts of errors that our learners are likely to make, because they're unlikely to make the same sorts of spelling errors as native learners do, although I have to admit I'm always very secretly pleased when Key Stage 2 mix up their V's and their B's. So typical errors made by Spanish learners, for example, tend to involve silent H's, their B's and V's, G's and J's, C's, K's and Z's, and Y's and double L's, and of course knowing where to put the accents as well. Now, this letter was sent to me by a 7-year-old Spanish girl, and as you can see at that stage, she was unsure which words had silent H's and which didn't. She confused her B and V sounds and was a bit hit and miss with the accents. Now, English-speaking learners learning Spanish are unlikely to make the same kinds of errors. Now, phonics are of the greatest importance. Oracy supports and reinforces reading and writing, and learners need to be aware of the links between sound and spelling. English is what's known as an opaque language, one with an inconsistent correspondence between letters and sounds. And therefore, generally speaking, learning to read and write is slower for native English speakers than it might be for speakers of more transparent languages like Spanish and Italian, where there is a much greater and a more regular correspondence between the sounds and the spellings. So it can be said that English speakers might find it easier to learn a more transparent language. Now, I'm sure all of our learners make spelling errors when they're writing in the new language. Some of them are a result of carelessness, but others can be explained in different ways. Some errors can be ascribed to the interference of English. Now, by the time students start to learn the new language in year 3, they've undergone 4 years of rigorous training in English spelling and phonics. And the new language is going to have different letter clusters and different letter sequences, but the students can often unconsciously replace these patterns with the more familiar English spelling patterns. So those 4 formative years of learning English spelling is enough to build a muscle memory. So it feels more natural, for example, for a student to write rough, R-O-U-G-H, than rouge, R-O-U-G-E, because the O-U-G-H letter cluster occurs in some very frequently used English words, and the O-U-G-E cluster is unfamiliar to most English native speakers. So if we look at this speech bubble, which I'm sure is, if you're a French teacher, it's making you shudder a bit, we can see some of the typical errors that learners will make due to the interference of English. So oui is often written as Q-U-I, as key, because Q-U is much more common in English than O-U at the front of a word. Then de is misspelt as UE is more common in English than EU. So think of words like glue, for example. And nation is more well known than natation. And we always assume that compagn is influenced by the English word companion. So it's clear that some focused work on spelling is necessary, drawing particular attention to those words that might suffer from the interference of English and those that contain specific graphemes. So I've been doing this with my year threes in particular this term. So I say the word or the phrase, and then we use our finger pencils to spell it out in the air together. So for this particular question in Spanish, ¿qué tal? And we do ¿cómo estás? At the same time as well. It's really good for the upside down question marks and for the accented characters as well. And of course, it's all about letter formation and getting your finger spaces in the right place too. So it also reinforces and references their English spelling, punctuation, and grammar work as well. You can also draw attention to certain important parts of the word by showing it with some letters missing. So this is a Spanish color, but it's got all its vowels missing. Have you guessed which one it is? That's right, it's amarillo. And then another strategy that makes children think about the size and the shapes of the letters in a word is by using word shapes. And the children need to think about which letters are taller than the others, which are the smaller letters and which hang below the line. So again, you have a French color here. You worked out which French color this is? That's right, it's rouge because the G is the one that hangs below the line. Now, the slow fade, I've been using this term with both words and phrases and short sentences as well. So you display the word on the board, but set the animation to fade slowly. I usually get it to fade over 8 seconds. The learners have to look at it. They have to study what's on the word, but they're not allowed to write it down until the word's completely faded. Then as soon as it's completely faded, they quickly write it down on their whiteboard and hold up what they've written. Now, this works in a very similar way to the don't repeat until I click speaking strategy. So the learner has to repeat the words and the spelling to themselves in order to be able to recall it at the necessary time. Something else you could try is multiple choice to see if children can spot the correct spellings amongst the incorrect ones. And this could go well after some focused work on spelling as part of a formative assessment. So children have to hold up for you the correct letter. I've got some voting sticks that have 4 letters on, 2 on the front, 2 on the back. And again, it's a very quiet activity that provides immediate feedback for you. Now, if like me, you were at secondary school in the early 80s, you will probably have had to do dictation in your language lessons. It was quite a scary thing, but I have to confess I secretly loved it. It involved quite a long text and it involved negative marking as well. And it then fell out of favour for a long time, but actually it's a great way of making children think about sound and think about grammar when you do it in a focused way. So this is an example of a Spanish dictation which focuses on the vowel sounds. So children have to listen to me saying the animal words very carefully, and they fill in the right vowels in the right place. Now, they're also using their knowledge of grammar to get the un or the una at the beginning of the words, and also to get the o and the a on the ends of the masculine and feminine words where appropriate. You can also use word puzzles like crosswords and word searches in class, but the use of these can be a little bit contentious. However, if nothing else, writing the word into a crossword makes you take care with the spelling so that it interlinks correctly with all the other words. And of course, being able to complete a crossword is a really good lifelong skill. Writing words without a pen, like using cutout letters to form the words, is less threatening than committing pen to paper, as it can be easily edited. When you're starting to think beyond individual words and towards sentences, you can try this activity. So children have to transliterate the sentences, putting in the capital letters, the full stops, and the finger spaces. And it makes them think carefully about the spelling of the words and the sense of the sentence that they're creating. An alternative to that activity is anagrams. So with this one, children know that they have all the letters that they need for each word, and they know where the finger spaces go. but they've then got to put all the letters in the right order to make the correct spelling of the words. Now, look right cover check is something that would suit upper key stage 2 as they're starting to learn meanings and spellings. And the idea is that you provide an accurate model which the learner then uses to repeatedly test themselves. So first of all, they look at and study the words in English and in the new language. Then they fold over the column on the far left, so German in this case, and write the German in the first blank column using the English as the stimulus. Then they unfold and check their writing. Next, they fold the two far left columns back so that they're using their checked German as the stimulus to fill in the English. Then they unfold to check the English and so on. So you can see that I use this method to help me to learn parts of the body in German, something that I just had a total mental block with. And you can see that by the end, I was getting them all right and even gave myself a smiley face. So these sheets also provide you with the evidence that the child has attempted the learning. Now, if we want children to spell words and read words aloud correctly, we need to ensure that they're confident in decoding and especially writing the accents and the other marks that English doesn't have, but which their new language does have. And it's worth taking a bit of time before formal reading and writing starts to alert the children to these marks, because we can't assume that they're automatically going to spot them, and to practice writing them. So this is a resource I use with Year 3, usually in the third or the fourth week of their language learning. The children trace the letters following the arrows where necessary. Now, recently, I haven't been able to share my laminated copies of this with the children, and so we've been using our finger pencils again to practice writing the letters in the air, saying what we're doing at the same time. So, for example, writing an A with an accent. I actually prefer it this way because I can see what all the children are doing and I know they're all practicing. We're all saying the sound and the mark as we do it. The only thing to remember is when you're the teacher, you have to do everything backwards. So learners need to know why these extra marks are important and what effect they're going to have on the writing if they aren't there. And in Spanish especially, this can be done with some humor. For example, tengo 8 años and me llamo. In French, there's also the issue of apostrophes, because for some children, apostrophes and accents are interchangeable in name and function and appearance. And we need to make sure that our learners know the precise reasons why both are there. So let's think next about how we can support our learners with their vocabulary as they start to use it, along with their grammatical knowledge to put together phrases, sentences, and for the more experienced ones, texts. We want them to focus on the structure without the worry of the words that are going to go in that structure. Now, recently there's been a lot of discussion and reflection about knowledge organisers, which are becoming more prevalent across the curriculum. So a knowledge organiser is a single A4 sheet containing a summary of the essential knowledge from a unit of work. It needs to be specific to the children in your class and should follow your scheme of work. It shows the big picture of a unit of learning in an easily shareable, low-tech format. And it's characteristic of the current Ofsted and DFE focus on a knowledge-rich curriculum and acquiring and retaining subject knowledge. Now, there's no set format for a knowledge organiser, but I think a languages one should probably include key vocabulary, plus any essential facts or structures presented in manageable chunks. They often contain model texts and can have images as appropriate. It's important that they also contain the English meanings to reduce the cognitive load and help children to use them effectively. And dodgy English, as it's known, is often used to emphasize structure in the target language. So, for example, j'ai faim would be I have hunger rather than I am hungry. Above all, the knowledge organisers should be engaging, should be clear, so that the children can use them easily and regularly. Now, they're not a magic solution to teaching languages. They should be seen as another tool in your kit and one of the solutions to problems of retention and memory. Having a knowledge organiser to hand means that children won't have to hold so much information in their working memory, and it enables them to constantly review their learning as well. The most commonly used format in Key Stage 3 is the parallel text approach, but I found from experience that this approach is really only suitable for Year 6, maybe Year 5, because of the amount of reading involved in English and in the new language. In other subjects, knowledge organisers are mostly lists of words and facts related to that unit of work. And the format that I've settled on to accompany my scheme of work can be seen on the screen here. So there's a list of the nouns that will be used, and then a selection of parallel Spanish and English sentences to show how we're going to use them. There's also an explanation of the grammar that's going to be covered, so plurals of nouns for this unit, plus the key verbs and the key sounds. So I've been giving these to my classes at the beginning of each unit, and the children are using them every lesson. They seem to like to be able to refer to them while we're doing speaking and listening work. And I've been able to answer a lot of questions so far by just saying, look at your knowledge organizer. I think they've been more useful so far to me than the previous word lists or writing frames, as everything they need is there, including the English. Now, I've also always been partial to a writing frame to support children as they start to write. In recent years, I found myself needing to add in further support, such as English translations or pictures to assist with understanding. Now, again, over the past year and a bit, we've all had a lot more time to think about things. So I did an exploration of sentence builders and the best format for Key Stage 2. And Joe Barnes-Moran came up with the flowchart format, which is proving useful in the classroom. It's very useful to be able to point out to the children that as long as they follow the arrows, the sentence will be correct, because some of them are still trying to go to places that the arrows aren't taking them. It's possible as well, of course, to use the more traditional table format, and I find it's a bit easier for children to miss out words and columns, though, with this format. The sentence builder is also technically a knowledge organizer, as it has the language that you need for a certain task all in one place and has the English on for extra support as well. Then, how can children extend their vocabulary to say what they want to say? So when we're teaching a new grammar point or new structure, it's best to introduce a small pot of words with which to illustrate that point, so the grammar doesn't get lost in a sea of vocabulary that the children aren't quite sure about. When we turn the children loose to be creative with the language, though, there will be some children who want to talk or write about something that we haven't taught them. To enable them to say what they want to say, which of course is what it's all about, it's important that we teach them how to use the bilingual dictionary. Now, these are two excerpts from the National Curriculum Programme of Study. Initially, we're going to be using, in the first one there, the familiar or learned vocabulary to build sentences, but it acknowledges that children want to broaden their vocabulary and specifies dictionary use as one way of doing this. So the children need to know how to track down a word in the dictionary quickly, how to use the guide words at the top of the page, and then the entry words on the page. They need to know what the abbreviations for the target language words mean, and how to check the whole definition instead of always picking the first word that they see. And it's well worth investing some time in this. I usually do it when I start teaching nouns and introducing the concept of gender in Year 3. In French, I do this using a book called Un Triangle by an author called Nejib. And the cover and each of the pages has a triangle cut out, and the triangle forms part of the pictures inside. The language used is super simple, as you can see with the page there that says une fille. And we read and discuss each page and decide whether the word on each page is masculine or feminine. Then I give them the challenge of creating a new book called Un carré, a square, which really does exist, by the way, and there's another one called Un rond. And so they use the dictionary to find the French words for things that are square, and using the same structures for the French, present their work in a mini book. So the children are being creative and finding out their own vocabulary within a given framework. So I've talked about what vocabulary is, why it's important, and the factors that should guide your choice of vocabulary to teach. I've outlined how you can present new vocabulary to children and practice it over several lessons until the children are confident. I've also mentioned ways in which you can support their vocabulary and how children can extend their vocabulary to help them to say what they want to say. So thank you very much for listening. I'll just stop my share now and then we'll see if anybody has any particular questions. So does anybody have any particular questions about what they've just heard? I don't see any in the Q&A, so either I was very clear or you can't think of anything. So does anybody have any particular questions or observations about vocabulary? Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Virginia. I'm glad that you thought so. So again, if you want to explore any of those things in more detail, most of them are on my blog somewhere. Thank you, everybody. You're very welcome. Thank you, Janet. Okay, so if there aren't any, oh yes, my website is Lightbulb Languages. If you Google it, you'll find it. There's a lot of resources for primary and a lot for secondary as well in French, Spanish, Italian, German, and Latin. That's right, Janet. We often need to be reminded, don't we, of things that we've heard about before, but maybe had forgotten about. Okay, well, thanks very much again, everybody. If there are no more questions, then I will say thanks once again for giving up your Sunday afternoon to come along and listen, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Bye for now. Bye.